Nicky Campbell presents the third in a 4-part series on the life and work of Elvis Costello. Part 3, If You Can't Bop to It, Bombsville.
I'm not sort of being a prima donna or melodramatic here. You know, it's an honest thing. I mean, occasionally you have to doubt the validity of what you're doing, and sometimes the best conclusion is to shut up.
You know, I saw them going down to do like a soul track. I was furious about it, you know, absolutely furious, because I knew I could play the music.
I walked into this room and I thought, he's finally gone. He's actually gone. He's got all these photographs of him looking at the crowd.
And it didn't matter what kind of haircut we had necessarily. It just mattered if you can't bop to it, Bombsville.
In 1982, after the disappointing performance of his Nashville aberration Almost Blue, executives at Elvis Costello's American record company were begging him to record a deliberately commercial album, preferably one which recreated the successful formula of his bestseller Armed Forces. Elvis, of course, had other ideas. He booked time at Air Studios in central London and began work on his most adventurous and experimental album to date, Imperial Bedroom. At the console, co-producing the album, was Jeff Emerick, who had engineered many of the Beatles' greatest records.
Because we had Jeff and he'd done Sgt. Pepper, we knew that this was a guy who had patience to sit down and make sense out of experiments. You know, he had written a book on that, on Strawberry Fields Forever and everything, all this stuff where the Beatles were just kind of messing around in the studio until they got effects that they liked, and then creating imaginative arrangements out of that. Well, we just knew that he had the patience and the ability to be able to sort out like the sonic soup he gave him, you know. And my co-producing really consisted of abandoning about a quarter of the arrangements that we had carefully worked out. I didn't like some of them things when we got into the studio. They sounded like, again, it was the same thing as Get Happy. They sounded a bit forced, some of it, you know. So I started rewriting some of the songs. I cut like the meter of one song in half vocally against the same rhythm track. So I had half as many words against a track going twice as fast as the vocal, which is the first track, Beyond Belief.
On Imperial Bedroom, Elvis was backed, as usual, by the Attractions, whose drummer, Pete Thomas, will never forget the day they cut Beyond Belief.
We only ever did that once, because I'd been up all night drinking with Larry Wallace, and I staggered into the studio, and it was one of those days when you just got to own up, you know. I just came in absolutely howling, you know, and just said, hey, I'm absolutely howling, you know. I can jam, I'll do a bit of tambourine, but I'm sorry, lads, I'm completely gone. But you see, old Elvis, he's got this thing, you know, he's clever. Whereas 99% of other people would either fire you or just send you home. He didn't. He said, well, have a drink, you know, like just get yourself happy. And I've got this song, Beyond Belief. And so I was like, oh, great, okay. So I had another drink, and we went in the studio and literally just jammed it. He just started playing it. I mean, if you listen to it musically, it's obvious that everyone's just kind of tagging along. You can tell it just feels its way into the song. And that was it. It was like one take, just literally following what's coming through the headphones, you know. And then we did that. We came in, and then they said, all right, Pete, you can go home now, that's it, you know. And so, in fact, it turned out I did a great day's work before I went to bed. Years later, I was in New Orleans, walking around with Gary Barnacle, the sax player, and we bumped into Slim Jim and Britt in this club. And Britt Eklund came up to me, because I sort of know Slim Jim a little bit, and Britt Eklund came up to me and she said, oh, I am so pleased to meet you. I think the drumming on Beyond Belief is the most fantastic drumming I have ever heard in my life. It's like, hello, Britt. And they invited us back to their flat, you know, and we were there till 6 in the morning having this great time, basically all on the strength of the drumming on Beyond Belief. So it just goes to show, you know, it's like there aren't any rules, really. I mean, there should be, but it's great that there aren't.
Attractions bass player Bruce Thomas.
I have to come out and declare myself, I think that's the best album we ever did musically, by a long, long way, because we were all throwing in musical ideas there. And If you listen to the rehearsal tapes, the finished thing is completely different. And that wasn't without its teething troubles either, that album. I remember Pete and Steve having a fight in the pub round the corner from Air, which ended up with one of them lying on the floor at Paul Weller's feet, and Paul Weller saying, "Well, you boys really take it seriously, don't you?"
We did have quite a lot of heated times over a record that you spent so much time over, particularly if I took a track off in a completely different direction through overdubs after it had been apparently recorded, you know. And Jeff Emmerich did the most remarkable job, really, in getting any of it to make sense. So, you know, the record kind of came out and was sort of overlooked almost completely in England commercially. And in America, they went to like ludicrous degrees. The critics went berserk, and you know, I was getting compared to Gershwin in the New York Times. And I mean, I met quite a famous cocktail pianist. This is an American guy called Michael Feinstein, and he worked for Ira Gershwin at one point. And Ira read the review in the New York Times that said I was compared to Gershwin, you know, and because he made him go out and get the album. And I have this image of Ira Gershwin sitting down to listen on the strength of a New York Times review to listen to Imperial Bedroom, you know, because I think this comparison was, I suppose, on the basis of the songs which lent towards that tradition, like Long Honeymoon, Almost Blurred. But what would he have made of Beyond Belief or Man Out of Time? What was he thinking?
So this is where we came to
Out of Time from Imperial Bedroom, which was released with an eccentric sleeve devised by Barney Bubbles, a painter and graphic designer who had worked on Elvis's records since the early days at Stiff. From his hot-wired brain came the striking checkerboard and knock-kneed Elvis of My Aim Is True, the bizarre laundrette and mannequin inner sleeve of this year's model, and the charging elephant origami fold-out of Armed Forces.
I asked Barney to kind of paint a painting for the sleeve of Imperial Bedroom. And I thought I'd made this incredibly sunny-sounding record, you know, a bright, more optimistic record, and it had some humour to it, more overt humour. And, you know, I didn't think it was a grim record. I thought the overall tone, with things like You Little Fool, with the harpsichord and everything. And then Barney painted this, you know, dark, really dark, kind of slightly malevolent-looking, very sexual painting. And I thought, is that what it sounds like? You know, it was like, well, to me, you know. I was delighted with the painting, you know. I mean, and I actually really wanted then to never have a picture on the sleeve again. And my ambition was then to do a series of records and have him paint the sleeve, to paint the music, as it were.
Sadly, Barney Bubbles died before he was able to complete the artwork for Elvis's next project, Punch the Clock. The album contained the song Shipbuilding, originally recorded by Robert Wyatt. Elvis had come up with words to a melody written by Clive Langer.
I wrote it with Robert Wyatt in mind, and I recorded it in Nick Lowe's front room, and it just turned out really brilliantly. But I was trying to write some words, and they just weren't working out at all. But I did have Robert Wyatt in my head all the time because it was influenced by his version of Strange Fruit. So, I played it to Elvis at a party one night. I just took him out and got him in the car and said, listen to this. And he said, brilliant, give it to me and I'll see what I can do. The next thing I knew, I was in New York. He called up from Australia and said, I've just written the best lyrics I've ever written. And I said, well, it's the best tune I've ever written. And that was that.
I was in Australia during the Falklands. It would have been very foolish to try and write something that predicted the outcome or tried to really pass comment on things that were still happening, you know. The logic I was following, that people would inevitably be drawn into it and there'd be tragic, you know, really genuinely tragic ironies, like people, say in the Northeast, or really anywhere, it could be Camel Eards and Birkenhead, you know, being given their jobs back to build more ships to send their own sons off to. So I wasn't being alarmist or trying to be morbid in any way. I thought that was the very least projection that you could make. In fact, I was taking a very benign corner of the whole story to write about, rather than writing about something very emotive like boys coming home in body bags and trying to write a kind of Vietnam sort of song, you know. I mean, the hardest thing for me was recording the song. I've sung it lots of times in concert where I've you know, connected with the song, but I don't believe my version vocally is worth a carrot next to his, you know. His was really the thing. I mean, it was just so... He has a really beautiful, plaintive voice anyway, and he just seemed to just... It's one of the best performances I can think of in terms of just reading a lyric, telling it.
Elvis's own version of Shipbuilding was distinguished by the immaculate trumpet of American jazz legend Chet Baker. Bruce Thomas.
It does have what I personally consider to be the best individual bit of musicianship that we've ever come up with ensemble playing. That's the pinnacle of our ensemble playing, especially when the catalyst is Chet Baker on that, because if you listen to the way he plays, the way he follows the bass line through the solo and things, he's really, really listening. And I think he you know, even though he's an absolute wreck of a carcass of a human being, he was the finest musician that we ever worked with. So having made all those jokes about blitzed out musicians and drunk and this and that, he was a man who looked like a corpse, and he played wonderful music. He played really well, he listened well, and he just brought the atmosphere of listening up in the room. So he played all that on the second take. We just did a quick rearrangement to make it longer, so he did a solo on the end, which I think is really, really a spine-tingling moment. It's just
Elvis Costello's version of Shipbuilding with the incomparable Chet Baker on trumpet. Before Punch the Clock, Elvis issued a one-off single under the pseudonym of The Imposter. Released in May 1983 in the run-up to the general election, Pills and Soap was his heartfelt comment on the state of the nation.
It was politically motivated, although I had to deny that because there was an election coming up. And, I honestly said it's about animals, because the impetus for it was this film called The Animals Film, which was a very long film about how humans... the relationship of humans to the animal kingdom, and how the very many misuses, from everything from animal experimentation to factory farming. And it was the thing that made me a vegetarian. Well, stopped me eating meat. So that was the initial impetus for the song. So I quite honestly could say that the images came from that, even though it's obvious to anybody, a cursory look at the lyrics and say that isn't the only thing it's about. I mean, the first rule of writing what you might call a subversive song is you don't tell everybody it's subversive. There was a slightly suspect political point being made by deleting it on the eve of the general election, and the outcome was such that we didn't re-release it in the glorious red vinyl reissue, as we all know to our cost now, but it's that one little thing. It didn't change anything. It was just one thing. I figured the song said a few things that I really felt something about, and there was a horrible inevitability about the Tory victory. And I figured, well, if you stick a song out there, at least it gives something for some people to feel some sympathy for, that at least they're not alone. I mean, I just felt maybe there were other people that felt as depressed about it and the inevitability of it as I did. And if there was a song that somehow said something that had that sympathy with that feeling, then it was better than there being no song. You can't delude yourself into thinking it was going to change anything. It just is a little bit of salve or something. It's just too bad.
Pills and Soap was later remixed for inclusion on Punch the Clock, an album produced by Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley, whose crisp commercial vision had contributed to a spectacular run of hits by Madness and Dexys Midnight Runners. It seemed that Elvis, in danger of becoming an esoteric cult act, was finally acknowledging the demands of the current singles market.
Clive's brief was definitely to be harder on my songwriting from a structural point of view, because I'd been completely indulgent on Imperial Bedroom, going any way I wanted, both in the structure and the style and the execution of the songs. And his job was to look for hooks and suggesting, well, he got me to write a couple more because I had too many morbid ballads to begin with. So he said we need some more rhythmic songs.
Bruce Thomas.
I think he was trying to get a hit. We were trying to get a hit, that wasn't that far behind this year's Model and Armed Forces stuff. We thought we still might be in with a chance of pulling something back, and this was the thing, they were the big pop producers at the time, and we were saying, all right, well, they know how to make pop records and make hits, let's get them to produce it, and maybe we'll get a couple of hit singles and we'll be back in business again.
Pete Thomas.
That was the first time anyone had really got us playing tricky arrangements that had to be right. He was more interested in getting the arrangement right rather than the feel of it or anything, because most of it would go on later. It wasn't like we were trying to get the whole thing in one go, which he did with Nick. You basically get the drums right, maybe the bass, and then they'd go on to work on the rest of it, sort of thing. I mean, there probably were exceptions, but it was more a question of building things up, which was different. But it's good in a way, because at least you know you're going to get somewhere in the end. You know that the end result is going to be good. And he got us playing some different rhythms and things, you know, like the Every Day I Write the Book was sort of funky, this real English whitey attempt at some sort of funk beat. But it was a hit, you know, so we would have just done it like the Mersey Beats, that song, you know, that was how Elvis wrote it. Well, I can remember it was like, every day I write the book, number one, number two, I'm so in love with you. Ooh.
In commercial terms, the collaboration with Langer and Winstanley worked perfectly. The contemporary dance groove of Every Day I Write the Book gave Elvis Costello and the Attractions their very first American top 40 hit, and Punch the Clock became their best-selling album since Get Happy 3 years earlier. But Elvis never seemed comfortable with the new production team's deliberation and attention to detail, such a contrast to the crazy spontaneity of Nick Lowe. Clive Langer.
The idea was to make Elvis popular again and to make some pop records after he'd done, you know, the wild ones. And I think we did well. I think it was just a different kind of discipline. You know, I've got different ears to Nick Lowe. I was brought up a few years after him later. I was probably more into pop music than American country kind of stuff. And that's what came out, probably. Alan's a very disciplined engineer, very strict, which they probably weren't used to. When we were going for a backing track, we'd be happy just to listen to the drums to make sure that every little thing that the drummer was doing was in time and perfect, and we wouldn't indulge in the pleasure of maybe and the excitement of hearing the whole band playing. We just, in the control room, we'd just have the drums soloed and make sure they were all right, because that's all we were bothered about. I should imagine Nick might have it blaring out and the whole band's jumping and everyone's having a great time, but a few days later they might find that there's a, you know, tom-tom mic that's fallen off, and even if we had everyone playing together, we'd then strip it, and once we're happy with the drums, we'd then do the bass, work on the bass for quite a few hours. Every slide would be in the right place, which is probably, it's easy to understand why someone doesn't like that process, because it's not the yee-haw rock and roll way of doing it.
I have been pretty hard on the two records that I made with Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley. I think really only because it's the only time I've really given myself over to a production sound, rather than working in kind of collaboration with the producer. I always sound like I'm deriding Clive and Alan's production style, but they were real pop producers, so inevitably the records date to the time they were made in. And with all due respect, I think that sound hasn't dated very well.
I still think it sounds good, but I understand what he means. I've talked to him a lot about it, and his criticisms, I understand them, I just don't agree with them.
The only flame in town from the next Elvis Costello and the Attractions album, Goodbye Cruel World. Once again, produced by Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley.
I think the first time we ever got really attacked for a new release, apart from when we first started, was Goodbye Cruel World. And to be honest, I knew it wasn't a good record by the time. It was the only one I was tempted to, you know, I was committed to it. I'd spent too much money. I couldn't not release it. And I thought, on balance, the good things that I'd got wrong in the studio that were in the songwriting probably outweighed the bad things that I'd allowed to happen in the production, which is it's not detracting anything from the effort that Clive and Alan made to do the best. I mean, I announced to them that it was the last record I was ever going to make before we went in the studio. You know, I decided to quit for all kinds of weird personal reasons, you know. I'm not sort of being a prima donna or melodramatic here. You know, it's an honest thing. I mean, occasionally you have to doubt the validity of what you're doing, and sometimes the best conclusion is to shut up. And, you know, I did really reach this conclusion really solidly at this point, and I think it had a lot to do with you know, extra musical things, as you might say. You know, really wasn't, I was, you know, really down, and about lots of other things, and I really just decided I wanted to do this one record, and I was asking them to make a record they weren't really set up to do, which was essentially a live in the studio record, and then we kind of had a loss of nerve about that and started to edge it back towards the kind of production they did anyway. But the damage had been done. We'd started out to record a folk rock record, is what it originally sounded like, in which you can hear in some of the more soulful songs on it, like Home Truth, which is like unbelievably kind of painful, true song. I made Clive and Alan's life impossible. And I mean, I take full responsibility for the failure of the production, because I was asking them one time to do one thing and next to do another, and changing my mind every 15 minutes and driving everybody in the band mad, you know. And just, you know, really just getting it as wrong as you can in terms of the execution of what are basically a bunch of really good songs.
Bruce Thomas.
Oh, yes, it was another I'm giving it all up job, though. But it shouldn't have been made, that album, but we were into such a momentum of album tour. I actually couldn't, to be quite honest, I couldn't conceive what I would do if I didn't get the advance for that album. So I was saying, no, we've got to do this album. But the songs are not up to the usual standard. I mean, it wasn't a swan song in terms of it was like a fine achievement to go out on. It would have been a rotten album to end on. Side 2 of that is instantly forgettable. There's a couple of stabs at a hit single with Only Flame in Town, which is like a string of rotten puns, really. That was the worst string of puns that he came up with, that whole thing about she's not tender and she's Tinder or something, you know. Oh dear, that is grim.
Clive Langer.
I remember saying to him on the second album I did with him, thanks for letting me come along and listen to you make your record, you know, but there's no point in me being here if you're going to do it all. And so when people work with us, we do have quite a strong say in what happens. I mean, otherwise there is no point. I was sympathetic to his concept, really, but not to the songwriting at the time or the way he wanted to record the album. And the only 2 tracks we were really left alone with were the 2 A-sides. And that's when we gained control again. I was getting on with him fine, I always get on with him, but I wasn't really agreeing with him, and we weren't together in the process of making that record, really. And I was just like a bit disappointed. For the first time I'd kind of made an album where I thought, oh, you know, it's a bit down this. And I mean, we survived, we got through the album, which was quite something. I mean, I've done albums where you don't get through them.
Pete Thomas.
We probably could have done without that whole scenario, really. That probably didn't help anything. Probably should all have had a holiday at that point, in fact, you know. It's funny now when, you know, like I was in some disco and I heard that I Want to Be Loved. It's like, blimey, this is like this really good disco dance record. But the whole feeling was so down, you know, about everything that I don't think we ever appreciated what we'd done. You know, even when we were not being at our best, you know, even when it wasn't going well, supposedly, it was still good, you know.
I Want to Be Loved, a reworking of an obscure soul B-side by Teacher's Edition, and another chart single from Goodbye Cruel World. By all accounts, an album coloured by the atmosphere of gloom in which it was made. Elvis's manager, Jake Riviera.
Just like any painter or architect, you know, not everyone can be the complete vision. You know, you're stuck with deadlines, and a record is a document of a set period of time and how you felt about that time, and then it's time to record it.
In the wake of Goodbye Cruel World, Elvis put the attractions on hold and became involved in a few extracurricular diversions. He produced the Specials' inspiring single, Free Nelson Mandela, and the Pogues album, Rum, Sodomy and the Lash. And he sang a rousing solo version of All You Need Is Love at the Live Aid concert in July '85. He also strapped his guitar on his back and took to the road, eventually teaming up with T-Bone Burnett, an idiosyncratic Texan who would go on to co-produce the next Costello album, King of America.
I was touring solo for the first time and really able to get under the skin of the songs, and I knew that there was a lot more to Inch by Inch. There was certainly a lot more to Home Truth than that version that was on the record. And I started to develop, you know, writing for the sound of the acoustic guitar and voice again. or at least putting that to the fore of the arrangement, and then arranged the instruments around it. And I toured with T-Bone Burnett, and in America, in a college tour of America, which was the first time I'd played solo since I'd been professional. Before we recorded King of America, we did this record as the Coward Brothers, which was this alias that we'd assumed during our tours together, where we'd come out as these embittered, estranged brothers who had sort of, the trouble had started when we had married the same woman, and all these sort of things that we told the audience that they obviously didn't believe for a moment. And we used to claim to have written every song that we were performing, even though we mostly performed covers, and it was just a stupid thing that you just develop on a tour. I mean, a lot of the humor of it was very much of the moment, doesn't bear much repeating, but it was a contrast to playing solo. It can sometimes get quite solemn, And we had quite a lot of fun doing it, and we made this one record of a song we'd written together in Italy called People's Limousine, and we recorded that for Demon under the name Coward Brothers.
The People's Limousine by Henry and Howard Coward, alias T-Bone Burnett and Elvis Costello. Recorded in Los Angeles, the album they co-produced, King of America, was credited to the Costello Show, featuring the Confederates and the Attractions. The Confederates consisting of American studio musicians, hand-picked by T-Bone Burnett.
Actually, there was a tremendous lot of planning that went into that record because we were on the road for several months, flying all around, and we had a lot of we had plane trips to Australia and Japan and things like that, and we talked a lot about it on those trips, about who would be the most appropriate musicians for each song. And we had pages and pages of production notes for that record, actually. Because the theme of the record was very much about America, I think he wanted to work with some American musicians on it. And I think a lot of the songs lent themselves to those sort of country players that we used on a lot of the record.
We sort of did like a cast list for every song, and it was a bit of an eye-opener for me, because I'd never worked with where you just call people up and you get such and such a name to come in, and suddenly he was throwing around these really famous musicians' names. I thought, well, how do we persuade them to work with us? Not that I said in any way they were superior musicians to the guys I've been working with. I mean, there were times I thought we were the best band there ever was, but I just decided that there was certain sort of approach that might work on some of these songs. And he's suddenly saying, well, we got James Burton, and these people. And when you're playing, when it's just you and acoustic guitar, and musicians kind of playing a much more supporting role, but they're musicians whose sort of understanding of accompaniment is quite different. And American musicians do have a greater sense of accompaniment than English musicians in the main, in my opinion. And certainly than a group that had grown up with the idea that anybody could take the spotlight. We'd kind of, it was the case with the Attractions, as I said before, that really the drums could be the feature thing on a track, not just the driving force behind the other instruments. Like, for instance, the song Beyond Belief is driven by Pete's rather unusual approach to it, It's led by the drums, as well. It isn't very common. Whereas in the studio with these guys, we would, arrange in a semicircle, and they would really play responsively to the nuance of that particular performance, and each one would be different. That's quite different to the stuff I'd been doing with the Attractions, particularly over the last few albums, where we've been crafting these records, for better or worse. So it was a bit more like the early records that I made, it was a lot more spontaneous.
There was an interesting thing that happened during those sessions, which was, there are a lot of prejudices, I think, mostly created by the media, by the press in particular, about, different generations of musicians. And I think Elvis was considered very punky at the time or something, and maybe Keltner was considered some old, horrible old session hack. And it was interesting getting all these people from different worlds together and finding out that actually it was just, they were all doing the same thing, which was playing music, and we were all musicians, and it didn't matter what kind of haircut we had necessarily. It just mattered if you can't bop to it, Bombsville.
Well, I had a little.
Elvis bopping with the Confederates on The Big Light. Things were progressing so well with his new collaborators that his old band's arrival in LA soon proved an embarrassment.
we cut like half the album in 3 days. So suddenly we had a bit of a problem, you know, in terms of the relationship between me and the band, how the balance would work out. It had already been the cause of some friction that I was even going to do this, you know, as I'd gone to Nashville and they'd gone with me. And I suppose it just made everybody feel insecure, you know. The problem being that when they did arrive to play on the stuff and the balance of the record was almost set against them, it didn't do anything anymore for anybody's morale, and they probably played the worst they'd ever played in the studio, and it just kind of blew us apart, really. And I mean, there was no way I was going to put inferior material on the record. We just couldn't. They were just suspicious, I think, of me and T-Bone and the relationship we'd developed, and you know, nobody really played to their best. The only thing I'll say is I think that the track that they do play on the album is probably the most emotional track on the record, because everybody knew it as well, you know. Unlike anything where you get into the end of it, sometimes it all went into that one track, which is Sort of Light, which is one of my favourites from it. There were some ugly scenes, I'm not going to pretend there weren't, you know, they weren't like arguments, it was just sad because we'd suddenly become like distanced in a way I hadn't realised had happened. I'd been very wrapped up in myself all through doing Goodbye Cruel World and really feeling sorry for myself and all this defeatist self-pitying bullshit about I was going to quit, you know, and I shut myself out of that, wrote a bunch of good songs. I was really, you know, and I had a sort of ally that was helping me to see the potential of recording in a different way. And suddenly I was like really like a stranger to these three guys that I'd really worked with a lot.
Attractions drummer Pete Thomas.
His idea was to have us there and the American session players, but obviously the American session players were all like friends of T-Bone, the producer, and we'd all got the needle, because it's like, well, here we are all in LA, and you know, I mean, it was literally like we were in the hotel and you'd see the other guys going down to do the session in the morning. I mean, I can remember telling T-Bone Walk and Mickey Carey, you know, I saw them going down to do like a soul track. I was furious about it, you know, absolutely furious, because I knew I could play the music. But there was just this thing going on, you know, I want to try different people, you know. I mean, really, he should have just said, I'm going to make a solo album, but don't worry about it. You know, like Tom Petty makes a solo album, but then goes back and makes Heartbreaker albums. The worst thing about it was that we were all there, not day after day, not getting the call to go to the studio. And then finally we did get the call that one day to go and do Suit of Lights, and I think everyone was so jumpy and paranoid and, you know, generally sort of edgy. I mean, it's a good track, but it was like the first take or something, you know. I mean, we only like played it once. And it was like, okay, thanks, you know, we won't need you tomorrow, we've got Jim Keltner coming in, and you know, and I was still drinking then, so you'd go back and just get really pissed off, you know.
In the perforated first light.
It just was all unfortunate. We shouldn't have been there at all, really. I mean, now it kind of makes sense that, you know, but I think it takes a gap of like 3 or 4 years before you can start saying, all right, well, Bruce, you play bass with this drummer, and you know, then it just, because we were such a family, whether you know it or not, we were, you know, that it all just seemed very painful.
Attractions bass player Bruce Thomas.
He couldn't really say, look, I don't want to work with you anymore, I want to do this with that. He never actually said that. He said, look, I think I want to try something else. He just sort of got us to turn up and there'd be another band. You know, I'd turn up and go and sit in a room, have a cup of coffee with somebody, and I'd say, oh, hi, who are you? And he'd say, well, I'm the bass player. You know, that was a kind of, you know, when you'd just gone halfway around the world and somebody said, oh, and he'd say, well, who are you? I said, well, he knew who I was, you know, because he said, listen, you know, I'm sorry, it's nothing to do with me. You know, all the musicians saying, look, don't feel bad about it. He said, look, I'm not trying to do you out of a job. It's not me, you know, he just said turn up, and they're all like, and you know, they're saying this, well, you're being very mature about it and all. And I said, well, look, I just, you know, what the hell's going on? He never really said, I think it's time we called it a day, and this is part of this, you know, he just didn't have the bottle to do it. And I remember going up to Elvis's room in Le Mondrian Hotel, and he got the whole room, we had about 20 large poster-sized proof of possible sleeves for King of America, which is him wearing a crown, but there was about sort of 20 of them propped around, all in different armchairs and on countertops and everything around the room, with all these different shots of him looking like the King of Belgium. And I walked into this room and I thought, he's finally gone. He's actually gone. He's got all these photographs of him looking at the crown. I mean, obviously it wasn't, it subsequently proved to be what it was. He just was looking at all these, but I thought there's a certain element of that to it, you know. I thought, yeah, he's gone. He's gone. He's going to have a throne sent up soon, and he's going to sit there like Orson Welles, you know.
Brilliant Mistake from King of America, the album which revealed Elvis in his most transitional phase.
It was a very emotional record to make. Plus, I'd got myself out of the depression that marred the making sense of the songs I had for Goodbye Cruel World. But I was having to sing songs that were as truthful as the ones that I got wrong on it, but hopefully and getting them right, you know. So I was singing a song like, as it were, the continuation of Home Truth is Indoor Fireworks. I think that's as soulful a song as I know how to write. You know, some people might find it maudlin simply because it's set in a country sort of style, but that's their problem, really. You know, I know it's as true as you like.
It's time to tell the truth. These things have to.
BBC Radio 1 FM series on Elvis Costello was presented by Nicky Campbell and co-written by Pete Frame and the producer Kevin Howlett. Next week, the final part. You can't ignore him.
No, wait a minute, love.
Well, you can't ignore him. There's no